should ever witness, let alone endure. In every sense of the words, they are American heroes. This is the story of the men captured by the Japanese and transported via hell ships to Japan, where they provided labor for the depleted Japanese workforce. Most of this information was provided by a 2003 independent study course from the Department of Veterans Affairs. Veterans Health Initiative, American Ex-Prisoner of War by Dr. William Skeleton, and from my own experience listening to their stories. Japan captured 34,648 Americans in the Philippines, of whom 12,935 died in captivity. The Japanese greatly underestimated the number of prisoners, especially those captured at Bataan and Corregidor. Little transportation was provided to the prisoners. Food, water, and medical care was insufficient, while cruel treatment, including beheadings, was rampant. The POWs were held in Bilibid prison until a transport ship could be arranged. These vessels came to be known as hell ships and are the focus of this paper. These large converted cargo and animal transport vessels were usually loaded in Manila Bay. Still, they were detained from sailing until the Japanese felt the waters were safe from American submarines. Conditions inside the ships were deplorable. With no escape from the sweltering heat, the POWs were packed tightly into crowded halls. If they could lie down, it was with great difficulty and much cooperation. The men were forced to stay in the holds for the entire voyage across the South China Sea or the Yellow Sea. Ventilation was non-existent, and refuse, which was kept in a bucket, was lifted once a day, and much of that spilled onto the men below. Episodes of madness were common. Death was a constant companion. On October 1st, 1942, the Tortilla Maru departed Manila with 1,992 Americans, British, and Canadians loaded into the three holds. It had arrived in Formosa on October 11th, and the men were given a fire hose bath. The Americans were kept for another 19 days until the ship docked in Busan, Korea, where 1,200 prisoners were sent to Mukden, the others to Osaka, Japan on November 12th. One of the most disturbing and senseless examples of loss of lives occurred on the Arisan Maru, which carried 1,800 POWs. An American submarine patrolling the South China Sea spotted the unmarked Arisan Maru, and on October 19, 1944, torpedoed it. As a result, 1,792 POWs lost their lives. The POWs who survived this terrible ordeal made it to China in a lifeboat. These men then had to walk across China and India, eventually reaching safety. The Arisan Maru was not the only ship on which so many died. On September 7th, 1944, the Shino Maru was struck by a torpedo, resulting in 668 deaths. On December 1st, 619 POWs were held at the Bilibid prison for transport on the Orioku Maru to Japan. The men were placed in the ship's front and rear holds, which were 40 feet by 80 feet. That provided enough space for about 250 men to lie down. The Japanese provided about 800, placed up to 800 men in each hold, and left them there until the ship filled. No food was provided for these 3 days, and water was rationed by the teaspoon. The combination of no ventilation, extreme heat generated by the 800 men in the hold, were left there until the ship was filled. No food was provided, and the water was rationed by teaspoon. The combination of no ventilation, extreme heat generated from the 800 bodies made the overall living conditions intolerable. Many of those stuffed in corners died of suffocation. On December 12, 1944, the Orioku was sunk in Subic Bay. The weak, starving, and dehydrated POWs had to swim 300 yards to shore. Many drowned in the waves. The Japanese took their anger out on the defenseless men with machine gun fire. The Japanese offered no medical assistance to the wounded. Many who remained on board were reported as mercy killing. Only 1,341 of the original 1,619 survived. The prisoners were forced to crowd onto tennis courts for several days. For water, there was a 6-hour wait for a dribbling spigot. The food was non-existent. And the men had to sit next to one another with no room for sleep or to escape the scorching rays of the hot sun. At night, the men were subjected to the cold winter air. On December 28th, 581 survivors of the Orioku were transferred into the Brazilian Maru, and 1,070 were placed into the Inora Maru. The two sister ships then set off for Japan. The Brazilian Maru was an animal transport ship that had not been cleaned before the POWs were crowded into the holds for the voyage to Japan. It took several weeks as they had to dodge roving American submarines. The lack of food, the near total darkness, and the absence of fresh air drove many to madness. Screams awful filled the holds at night. Some would cannibalize the weak or dead, and blood-sucking was common. Once a day, a pot of rice and seaweed soup was lowered to the prisoners. The soup usually spilled, and the men were desperately scrambled for the dropped rice, which had fallen onto the animal manure. Only a few men got any food at all. Most got nothing but a teaspoon of water. A few men. Each morning the Japanese dropped ropes to haul the corpses for those who died during the night. Usually the bodies of 30 to 50 men were tied and were thrown over the side. As the ship drew further north, the warm tropical air gave way to freezing temperatures, and a high of 20 degrees was the norm. The men jammed together would remove the clothes of the dead, as well as the sick and dying. The mood inside the hull was of isolation and hopelessness. Of the original 16 chaplain, only 4 were still alive when the ship arrived in Chinese waters. The ship was attacked several times by American Navy planes. On January 8th, more than 300 men were killed by explosion. Only 497 POWs survived the trip to Kyushu. Even when the men arrived in Japan, the humiliation was not over. A Japanese medical officer boarded the ship and detected the presence of dysentery. and ordered an examination. The POWs were forced to publicly strip naked on the open dock and bend over poles. The Japanese medical personnel then inserted rods into their rectum to examine them for parasites. From December 28th to the 31st, the Inura sailed to Formosa. The ship was attacked several times while docked and full of prisoners. On January 9, 300 prisoners were killed and 250 wounded. The next day it was attacked again, and survivors were forced to remove 300 mangled bodies from the metal girders inside the bombed-out ship. Of the original 1,311 on board, only 619 survived. On January 13th, all the POWs were transferred to the Brazilian Maru. Beginning on July 17th, 1944, and continuing over the next several days, 1,539 men were loaded into the bows of the Nice Maru. Again, with no food and bearable heat, fainting was common, yet because the men were crowded so tightly, fainting was common. But since they were crammed so tightly into the space that they were forced to stand with their arms to the side, there was no place to fall. The men became crazed, pushed, screaming, swearing at one another. To make matters worse, most of them had dysentery, and there were no toilet features. The rough waters of the China Sea also took a toll on the men. Seasickness and vomiting were common. Despite the senseless and tragic loss of life, the Japanese still refused to mark the ships as carrying POW. In all, 25 unmarked ships transported Allied and American POW. All were verified as having been sunk. And of the 901 men transported, 10,853 died due to submarine air attack. Many of the ex-POWs continue to suffer from unique medical conditions resulting from their internment. As of 2025, the VA estimates the number of living World War IIs who were POW at around 2,000, but that number is rapidly declining due to their age and their medical issues. This was a really tough story for me to write.
Yes.
I like to write about humor, and this was more about horror. So I was a clinical social worker. I co-facilitated their support group.
Mm-hmm.
And so once a month they would meet, coffee and donuts, and then one or two would get up and tell their stories, how they were captured or about their internment. And then the group would give them feedback. Well, that's kind of how I look at this group. We're not POWs, but we're all veterans or family of veterans. We meet once a month, we have coffee and donuts, we get to tell our stories and hear back from our fellow veterans. The only thing missing is a social worker, and I'm here.
Oh, wow. I try not to identify myself with those men.
Gotta get the thing in there.
But it's
He's gonna
really
fall.
hard and I
That's
don't
something
know.
for our next newsletter.
Hang on.
He's getting wobbly.